Okay, so have you ever, stopped and thought, huh, that felt strangely familiar, like I swear that exact thing has happened before?
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone has those moments where reality seems to glitch or stutter for a second.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of where we're headed today with this deep dive. So strap in because we're tackling a real head spinner. The idea that our whole reality, everything we experience, could actually be a computer simulation.
Sounds like science fiction.
It does, but it's a question that some really brilliant minds have been grappling with. And we're going to dive into a recent podcast that explored this very idea, no stone unturned.
It's a topic that pulls from so many different areas like philosophy, physics, computer science, even pop culture.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And this podcast episode we're looking at offered some really interesting arguments and perspectives. So we're going to unpack those and see what makes sense.
And more importantly, what does it all mean for us? If our reality isn't quite what we thought it was.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics for anyone who's new to this whole concept. The simulation hypothesis basically proposes that everything we see, feel, touch, experience, the entire universe could be a super sophisticated computer program run by a civilization way more advanced than us, kind of like we're all living in a hyper-realistic video game.
Exactly. And the podcast we're looking at actually trace this idea back through history.
Yeah.
It's not just a modern concept. It's something humans have been pondering for centuries.
Like, what are some of the historical touch points they mentioned?
Well, they brought up Plato's allegory of the cave,
Mm-hmm.
this idea that people might mistake shadows for reality itself, which is a really powerful metaphor even today. And then there's Descartes. He was obsessed with the idea that we could be deceived about the nature of reality, maybe by some evil demon controlling our perceptions. So these are early examples of philosophers wrestling with the same question: is what we experience truly real?
Right. So the seeds of the simulation idea have been around for a while, but it really took off in the early 2000s thanks to a philosopher named Nick Bostrom. The podcast spent a good chunk of time on his work. What did they highlight about his argument?
Well, Bostrom's core idea is that if advanced civilizations eventually gain the ability to create these super realistic simulations with conscious beings inside, then statistically speaking, it becomes way more likely that we're living in one of those simulations than in the original base reality.
That's a pretty wild thought. Let's break that down a bit. Why would there be more simulated minds than real ones?
Because if you think about it, a civilization with that level of technology could create tons and tons of simulations, each with billions or trillions of simulated beings. And those simulated minds would quickly outnumber the minds in the original reality. So purely by the numbers, it becomes more probable that any given conscious being exists inside a simulation.
So it's like a numbers game. The odds just tilt towards simulation if you're considering all the possible minds out there. Okay. That's a pretty mind-blowing concept to start with. So the podcast then dove into some of the arguments that actually support the simulation hypothesis. And the first one they brought up was Moore's Law and the idea of accelerating computational power. Can you explain how that ties in?
Sure. So Moore's law is basically the observation that computing power has been doubling roughly every 2 years for decades. And the podcast emphasized that if this trend continues far into the future, civilizations could reach a point where creating these insanely detailed simulations becomes not just possible, but relatively easy.
Like, we're already seeing crazy advancements in video game graphics and virtual reality every year. So if you extrapolate that out centuries or millennia, the idea of simulating an entire universe doesn't seem quite so far-fetched.
Exactly. And the podcast even made a comparison to how video games only render what you're currently looking at to save processing power.
Right.
Maybe the universe does something similar, only generating details as we observe them.
Wow, that's a trippy thought. Okay, so that's Moore's Law. Then the podcast brought up something even wilder, the weirdness of quantum physics and how it might hint at a simulated reality. What's the connection there?
This gets into the whole observer effect in quantum mechanics, which is one of the most baffling aspects of modern science. The basic idea is that subatomic particles don't have definite properties until they're observed. And some people interpret this as evidence that our reality isn't fully formed until we interact with it. Kind of like how a computer game doesn't render everything in perfect detail until a player's looking at it.
So it's like the universe is constantly updating itself based on our observations. That's a seriously mind-bending concept. All right, what was the next argument they explored?
Well, they talked about how the laws of physics are fundamentally mathematical, which lends itself to the simulation idea. If everything in the universe, from gravity to light to the behavior of atoms, can be described by mathematical equations, it suggests that reality itself might be based on some kind of underlying code, kind of like a computer program.
It's like the universe has its own operating system written in the language of math, which would make a lot of sense if we were living inside a giant computer simulation. Okay, so far we've got some pretty compelling points for the simulation idea. What other arguments did the podcast present?
Well, the last one they focused on was the nature of consciousness itself and how it might be
Hmm.
simulated if consciousness is essentially information processing, as many neuroscientists believe. Then theoretically, that same information could be run on a different kind of hardware, like a really powerful computer.
So even our thoughts and feelings could be simulated, which opens up a whole can of worms about what it really means to be alive and conscious, right? But hold on a sec. We've only heard one side of the story so far. This podcast was really good at presenting both sides of the argument, and they also delved into some strong counterpoints against the simulation idea. What were some of the key challenges they raised?
The first, and probably most obvious one, is that we simply have no direct evidence for a simulation. We haven't found any hidden code, any glitches that can't be explained away by normal physics so far. It's all theoretical and philosophical.
Right. It's a fun thought experiment, but without any concrete proof, it's hard to say it's anything more than that. What other counterarguments did they bring up?
Well, they also talked about the immense complexity of simulating a universe like ours, down to the tiniest detail. It would require unimaginable computing power, potentially more energy than entire stars produce, which makes you wonder if any civilization could ever achieve that, even with super advanced technology.
It's a good point. The scale of the task seems almost insurmountable, even if you imagine a civilization millions of years ahead of us. What other challenges did they mention?
They brought up the observer effect again, but from a different angle this time. If our reality is being constantly simulated, wouldn't we expect to see more obvious glitches, inconsistencies, things that break the illusion? But our everyday experience seems remarkably consistent and stable.
Yeah, it's a fair point, although some might argue that the simulators are just really good at their job, patching up any errors before we notice them. Okay, and what was the last big counter-argument they explored?
The big one, the why question. If some super advanced civilization is simulating us, what's their motivation? Is it some kind of experiment, a form of entertainment? Are they studying their own past? Or is there a reason we can't even comprehend?
Right. It's a big leap to assume we understand the motives of these hypothetical simulators. It's kind of like ants trying to understand why humans build skyscrapers. But
Yeah.
even without a clear answer to the why question, the podcast didn't stop there. They went on to explore some of the deeper implications of living in a simulation, if it were true. What were some of the thought-provoking ideas they raised?
Well, it got into the whole religious and philosophical side of things. If our universe is designed by these simulators, it's hard not to see them as a kind of godlike creator, setting the rules of our existence and determining our fate. In a way, it's a modern take on the idea of a divine being.
It really reframes the whole creator question in a fascinating way. And what other mind-bending implications did they explore?
Well, they got into the possibility of breaking free from the simulation, or at least communicating with simulators, which is pure speculation, of course. But if we could prove we're in a simulation, maybe we could find a way to hack the system or send a message to the outside world, like those scenes in The Matrix where they jack into the mainframe.
Definitely sounds like a sci-fi movie waiting to happen. But then they tackled a really crucial question. If all of this is just a simulation, does that mean our lives are meaningless? Do our experiences even matter?
Right. That's a heavy question. And the podcast offered a really nuanced perspective on it. Some might argue that a simulated existence is inherently less real or meaningful, but ultimately our experiences are still our experiences regardless of their origin. The love we feel, the joy, the sadness, those are all real to us, and that's what truly matters.
Yeah, that's a crucial point to hold on to, whether we're in base reality or a hyper-realistic simulation. Our lived experiences are what shape us and give our lives meaning. So to wrap things up, what were some of the key takeaways from this deep dive into the simulation hypothesis?
I think the podcast did a great job of highlighting that we just don't know for sure if we're living in a simulation or not. It's a question that's still very much open for debate, and there are strong arguments on both sides. It really underscores how much we still don't understand about the nature of reality itself.
Absolutely. It's a mind-blowing concept that pushes us to question everything we thought we knew about the world around us and even ourselves. So as you go about your day-to-day, maybe pay a little closer attention to those moments when things feel a little off or strangely familiar. And with all this new information in mind, what do you think is our reality, just a really good simulation? It's a question worth pondering. But thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the simulation hypothesis.